Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. We're going to give people just a couple of more minutes to join the webcast, so please hang tight and we'll be right back. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Kelly Neff, the National Cloud Marketing Manager here at Veeam. I'd like to welcome you to today's presentation hosted by OffsiteDataSync and Veeam Software. You know, we've always loved collaborating with OffsiteDataSync on webinars like this because we've been partners with them for so many years, but also because OffsiteDataSync is just truly an expert when it comes to data protection. At Veeam, they are a nationally recognized, award-winning, platinum-level cloud and service provider, and that's our top-tier cloud and service provider level. In fact, you know, they were our growth partner of the year last year at Veeam, which makes them one of the very largest cloud and service providers that we have at Veeam. So they literally have tens of thousands of physical and virtual machines under protection using Veeam-powered services. So they are just truly experts at what they do. So we appreciate being with them today. Leading our webinar today, we have two experts contributing their years of experience. They are Brad Jervis, Senior Cloud Architect from OffsiteDataSync, and Brandon McCoy, Cloud Systems Engineer at Veeam. So thanks, guys, for organizing our presentation today. Sure appreciate it. So you'll see our topics today. We're talking about as a service, all the options that are available to you today. So appropriately, we titled today's presentation, Confusion as a Service. We're going to try to break down, you know, the most popular as a service options like backup as a service and DR or disaster recovery as a service, IaaS, you know, infrastructure as a service, to give you our take on their unique differences and when you should choose one service over another, or when to combine them, and you know, who do you turn to for support and help with all this? It is getting confusing, so that's why we're glad you're here, so we can help you kind of sort it out. So as we get started, we have put you into listen-only mode. I would just simply encourage you to please use the question panel, you know, within the webinar platform. The questions are anonymous, so you know, don't be shy. Please, you know, put your questions out there, and I'll circle back at the end of the presentation, and we'll get all your questions answered. So, without further delay, I will turn the stage over to Brad at OffsiteDataSync.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This is something that's near and dear to our hearts at OffsiteDataSync, and specifically me, because I feel like these are questions that I have to answer all the time. You guys offer so many as-a-service offerings. How do I know what's right for me? How do I know what's the right fit for my business? Maybe I'm a little bit skeptical of the cloud still. I don't really know if I want to move my workloads to the cloud. Is it going to perform okay? Are my users going to be happy with the experience? There's a lot of questions that come into this whole new paradigm that we've entered with as-a-service offerings based on cloud platforms. So hopefully today we can clear up a little bit for you. Now, as we mentioned, there are umpteen as-a-service offerings. We're going to mostly be concentrating on the three as it relates to OffsiteDataSync. So those are going to be our infrastructure as a service platform, which we're going to be leveraging our enterprise caliber cloud to be able to actually run your infrastructure inside the cloud completely. So we're basically talking about everything running in the cloud. The entire user experience is in the cloud, and assuming everything works well for you, you don't have to worry about a lot of the management and everything that comes along with having that infrastructure on site. You're basically moving that off into OffsiteDataSync's cloud. The second thing we're going to talk about is going to be disaster recovery as a service. So this is basically saying maybe I'm going to have my infrastructure in my local site, in my data center, maybe even an offsite data center I have a colo in, but I do want to take advantage of these cloud offerings. I want to take advantage of the reliability, of the management aspects, of everything else. So maybe I want to have my disaster recovery in the cloud. And for a lot of folks, this is going to be a good transition to the cloud because, you know, for every disaster recovery solution, we want to make sure that we do our DR testing and everything else. And during that testing, maybe you say, well, you know what? Things perform just as good and maybe even better in the cloud. So it might be worthwhile to look into potentially moving that environment over into the cloud if it's going to save us some money. So it might be a good transitionary period if you're thinking, well, I know what benefits the cloud has. I know exactly what it can do. This is just going to be kind of a test. And if that test works out well for you, maybe you have a good incentive to go to your boss and say, well, here's how I can save some money by moving our infrastructure to the cloud. We have some renewals coming up on a lot of our hardware. It's going to cost us this amount, whereas we could probably look at saving this amount by moving it into the cloud. And lastly is going to be our backup as a service offering. This is kind of the entry level as a service because all we're going to be doing is sending your backups into the cloud. So we know that they're protected. We know that they're going to be available in the event of any sort of disaster that were to happen to our main data center, our primary site. But this is also going to serve as a good transition point to say, okay, well, maybe the cloud isn't so bad. I've been in the industry for quite a while, and just like with virtualization, when cloud came out, everyone was very, very against it. They weren't sure how it was going to perform, and as the technology has matured, and as we've gotten some of these more services, and we've seen larger environments moved up to the cloud with great success, backup as a service is going to be a good thing to dip your toes into the water and be able to say, okay, well, maybe the cloud isn't so bad. And here at OffsiteDataSync, we have a lot of really cool features behind our very base level backup as a service that I'm going to talk about a little bit later, just to kind of give you a little bit more of an incentive to say, okay, well, maybe the cloud isn't so bad. So first and foremost, let's talk about infrastructure as a service. And in our little quote here, we have less reacting, more readiness. So what does that mean? Well, that means that you don't have to respond to any sort of infrastructure-related issues. Maybe you have some sort of misconfiguration that resulted in some sort of outage. Maybe you had some sort of hardware that failed. Maybe you were performing an upgrade on some of your hardware only to find out that maybe an additional network card or something at some of your hosts might not have actually been compatible with that software, and suddenly you have to roll back and your entire environment is down because of that. So we're removing a lot of that reactiveness that comes with running your own infrastructure, all of the research, all of the upgrade planning, everything that's involved in doing that, because you're leaving that to us and our experts who have been doing this for years. And by more readiness, we mean that you're ready to accept that this environment is going to be available for you 24/7. So let's talk a little bit about the benefits of infrastructure as a service. One, it's dynamic. If you're locked into your specific infrastructure, and let's say you have a need to expand your environment maybe 2-3 times the amount, well, you have a long process ahead of you. You have the whole architecture as far as building out the environment. What host do I need? I need to make sure that if I'm going to keep my regular cluster, that I'm going to be buying hardware that's compatible with that. There's a whole lot that goes into planning a large-scale deployment like that. And with so many industries now growing 2 times, 3 times over the course of a year, this dynamic expandability is going to be able to provide your company the room to grow without the need to dedicate all those engineering resources to determining if this is going to be feasible, or potentially even just wiping everything out and replacing everything with all new hardware. So by going to infrastructure as a service, you're basically removing that burden from you. You can expand as you need to as much memory, CPU, storage, however much you need, and that's going to be available to you in a dynamic sense. The next portion of that is going to be it's secure. So when we say secure, we mean that everything at OffsiteDataSync, specifically our infrastructure as a service, is backed by any number of certifications, SOC 2, any of the acronyms that you can think of, is all hosted in our state-of-the-art data centers, to where security is a complete 100% top priority for us. So we're not worrying about maybe having our data center, as some organizations tend to do, in unlocked cabinets that anyone can go into, where people could have potential console access immediately to those hosts or VMs or anything else. Everything is stored in the top-of-the-line data center. So this is a great advantage for you as a potential consumer to take advantage of these security practices that we have by going into our data centers. So this way you don't need to build it yourself because it's already there and provided by us. And finally, reliability. All of our infrastructure as a service is backed by dozens and dozens of hosts, depending on the environment that you're in. So if there's any sort of initial failure, we're not going to be able to actually tell from your side that there was a failure, because everything is built onto a reliable framework, all highly redundant, and we have a lot of really cool technology on the back end that even in the event of a host failure, we allow automatic failover of that host to a different piece of compute node that's able to spin that up on the fly. So there's a lot of reliability that's built into us based on a lot of technologies such as Cisco UCS, such as Nimble storage, such as VMware NSX. Everything is built on a lot of these reliable technologies. So we've already done that work for you. So you don't have to worry about a single point of failure across the entire environment. So great, that all sounds wonderful. Now, who is IaaS best suited for? Because obviously everyone wants all of those 3 things. Dynamic, secure, reliable, who wouldn't want that? Well, IaaS is going to be best suited for those who value cost. Cost is going to be a big factor in whether or not you want to move into this IaaS environment. Let's say, for instance, if you recently purchased all new hardware for your local data center, and maybe that incurred some sort of operational expense, well, it's probably not going to be the best idea to move into the cloud after that, because the whole idea of moving into IaaS is you're no longer going to need that hardware. So maybe it's something to think about down the line, and maybe we want to start planning for it once those hardware renewals come up. But it's something that you really want to take into consideration. Now, for those of you who might be entering the 3rd or 4th year of life with a lot of your hardware, it's certainly something to think about, and it's certainly something to investigate and say, well, maybe I can actually save a lot of money on IaaS. As I mentioned before, if you crunch the numbers and it ends up working out, it's always good to go to your boss and say, well, we've tested the performance, everything looks good, and here's how much money we can save. So it's certainly going to be worth an investigation, especially when you're coming up to those end of your renewals. Again, reliability. For those of you who maybe you don't have the largest IT teams in the world, who don't have all the time to go through, read every single patch note on every single operating system, whether it be hypervisor specific or what have you, you know that our experts are going to be performing all these tasks for you. So you don't have to worry about the small IT team. You can concentrate on those goals and those projects that you have to ensure that your users are able to perform at the best capacity while leaving all of the infrastructure maintenance and everything up to us. So you can basically offload that position of your job over to our employees who are experts in this field. Lastly is growth. As I mentioned before, with regards to dynamic, the growth potentials are limitless. As far as your organization wants to grow, you can grow as much as you want in that environment. So there's no restrictions on that. And that certainly is going to come into play when you're thinking about, well, maybe I should renew this infrastructure, or maybe my company is going to be acquiring another company and there might be some good prospects. So there might be a dollar add value in saying, well, okay, it's going to be easy for us to grow, whereas if we purchase all new infrastructure, maybe not so much. Maybe we'll have to wait for things to ship, going to be a huge project, going to take on our resources, whereas with the infrastructure as a service, you're effectively just going to say, okay, I need more resources, and boom, you have it right there. So very, very good for companies who are expecting a large amount of growth over the next 1, 2, maybe even 5 years. So let's go into a little bit about how the infrastructure as a service is laid out. So again, on-demand infrastructure. You can go from a single server environment and you can dynamically expand it to as much as you need. So that's where the on-demand comes from. You can expand out as much as you need, as much as that demand requires. In fact, we have a number of customers who use our infrastructure as a service because they have some of these dynamic workloads, specifically customers who have web services who tend to get exceptional amounts of traffic during specific months or specific days during the year. And what they have done is they've actually built out templates to expand out their infrastructure to be able to handle any additional amounts of traffic. And some of them are 10 times the magnitude of normal. And then once that's done, they just spin down that infrastructure and they're able to proceed with their regular environment. So that's where the dynamic aspect actually comes from. And for those customers, it's working out quite well for us. The other good thing is pay as you go. You're only going to pay for as much as you use, and this is also going into that dynamic piece of it. You don't want to pay for more than you're actually going to be using, so you basically are going to be paying for whatever it happens to be that usage. So it makes certainly a lot of sense for some of these industries. And with regards to compliance, as I mentioned, our data centers are built on a Tier 5 Platinum design. For those of you who might be confused about that and say, well, data centers typically only go up to Tier 4, so Tier 5 is actually built on top of the Tier 4 and actually includes a lot more items as far as redundancy because, frankly, our provider deemed it unacceptable with how Tier 4 was designed because, yet, it is very reliable and there's a lot of highly available aspects of it, but they just thought it didn't go quite far enough. So specifically with infrastructure as a service, when your entire environment is running on this platform, you want to make sure that everything is up to spec, everything is highly available so that even if the worst were to happen, you're able to continue your services and be running. So the complete manageability. So what this is basically saying, okay, so even though you're offloading a lot of the infrastructure into OffsiteDataSync's hands as far as being able to run patches, ensure that everything is up to date, resolve any kind of hardware failures or what have you, you still have the complete manageability of your environment. So that means that we give you complete console access, we give you complete overview of the firewall, everything is in your hands outside of the actual underlying hardware and infrastructure. That's on us. As far as managing your environment, that's entirely in your hands. And proactive DR. So rather than waiting for that DR event to occur, infrastructure as a service can be used to proactively prevent any sort of DR event. So let's say you move your environment up into the cloud and you experience a DR event, well, that infrastructure as a service piece is certainly not going to be affected by that. So whether your users have to move to a temporary office space or work from home, we can say that their connection into their regular environment is going to be exactly the same, and we've effectively mitigated the need for a DR strategy. So speaking of DR, great segue, I must say, let's talk about the disaster recovery as a service offering. So the whole thing about disaster recovery is we're going to get you up and running as quickly as technologically possible. And that piece is going to come into play here, as quickly as technologically possible. because there are some limits to technology as far as how fast we can get your environment up and running, but those limits are actively getting reduced over the course of new pieces of software, new features, things of that nature. So that's why we like to say as quickly as possible, because this is always changing. 3 or 4 years ago, we might have said, well, maybe we can get you up in 45 minutes. And now it's come down to, okay, we'll do our best to get you up in 15 minutes. And there's a lot of really cool software coming out specifically from these Veeam folks who are going to be able to reduce that even more down to the seconds. So that's why we like to say as quickly as possible, because our engineers and our experts and architects are always looking into the new technologies that are coming out, how they can benefit our customers, and how we can make the disaster recovery experience as seamless as possible. So let's talk about the benefits of disaster recovery as a service. One is going to be the low RTO, and for those of you who might not be in as much of the world of disaster recovery as backups as I am, RTO stands for Recovery Time Objective. So Recovery Time Objective is saying, okay, from the point that I experience the disaster, what is the time that I can expect to have all of my services up and running and ready and available to my users? So let's say my DR plan says I can spin up all my servers within an hour and create availability to my users within that hour of a disaster. My RTO would effectively be 1 hour long. So that's the benefit of DRaaS, is we're basically sending live copies of your virtual machines into the cloud. So all we need to do is spin them up on the drop of a dime, and we can reach those low RTO targets. The next thing is going to be the seamless connection to the DR environment. So especially with Veeam, there's a lot of really cool features with Veeam replication, which is what our DRaaS platform is based on, that you can do to provide seamless connection into that DR environment. I'm not going to go into it too much here because, frankly, I could speak at length about it for probably an entire webinar's length. But definitely check out some of our other documents, and we have a wonderful YouTube page up that has some previous webinars about Veeam Cloud Connect replication. But there's a lot of really cool things that allow you to expand your network into the cloud in the event of any sort of disaster. Just to give you a little bit of a hint, there's a lot of really cool layer 2 site-to-site VPN technologies. So let's say you lose one of your VMs, you can actually spin up a VM in the cloud and be able to connect to it over the same local IP address that you normally would, even though it's in the cloud, because it's extended via a layer 2 site-to-site VPN, which is powered by Veeam software. So all I'm going to say about that, but if you want some more details, feel free to ask questions. Feel free to hit up our sales team. We're more than happy to walk you through exactly how it works. But again, not too much time for the purposes of today. The last piece is going to be reliability. So our environment that you're going to be sending your data to is, again, not based off of the same environment as the infrastructure as a service platform, but done with the same mindset. So everything is highly available. Everything is capable of withstanding, N+1 host failures, things of that nature. So there's really, not too much of a concern about the typical DR environment, which, if you follow what most organizations do, they tend to retire old hardware, send that hardware to the disaster recovery data center, and then in the event of a disaster, you spin up your environment there. Well, there's a lot of problems with that, because maybe that hardware was retired for a reason. Maybe you couldn't really run your infrastructure too well on it. Maybe there's some failures that we don't know about, and by moving critical workloads over to that, we might experience some failures as far as memory and everything else that just simply wasn't alerting because we didn't really have any workloads on that. So it's been the paradigm that folks have used for a long time, but there are a lot of dangers from that, and we've experienced this a number of times with customers who've come to us and said, well, we thought it was going to be good, we were going to save some money by doing it, but at the end of the day, it didn't actually end up being a viable solution. So who is disaster recovery as a service meant for? So especially folks who have critical workloads who need to reach those low RTO targets. If your business is losing X amount per every hour that you're down, it's a very easy proposition to say, well, even if my business is maybe only going to lose 2 hours a year because of a potential disaster, if the money I'm losing for those 2 hours a year is going to cost the business more than it would cost us to actually have a working, great disaster recovery as a service product, well, then it's an easy decision to say, let's go with the disaster recovery as a service. And that 2 hours a year is going to be a very low piece of actual time that we're going to be unavailable. Depending on your physical location, there's certainly the possibility that many disasters could affect you even more than that. So it's going to be something that you have to kind of look at as far as your business model. Say, okay, well, how much are we willing to lose if we don't have a disaster recovery as a solution, and how much are we willing to lose if we do? And it's all comes down to dollars and cents right there. Other folks are you folks in regulated industries. We're talking about healthcare, we're talking about finance. It's in these industries that you actually have an obligation to spin up your environment. It doesn't really matter about the dollars and cents, although for the latter option, finance, it's certainly going to be beneficial to have a disaster recovery solution. But for those of you in these regulated industries, you really need to consider the regulations that you're tied to. If they demand that you have a disaster recovery solution, specifically ones that meet these low RTO goals, then it's your obligation to ensure that you have a solution like this, and it's going to come down to what's going to be the best for your environment. And that's where talking to some of our sales folks comes into play. Also, for those of you who don't mind being a bit hands-off, so with disaster recovery as a service, you're basically using our cloud to host your disaster recovery environment. So you won't, just like infrastructure as a service, you're not going to have access to the underlying infrastructure, you're not going to have access to any of the underlying hosts or what have you. You're going to have access to your virtual machines and the network connection to be able to provide that access to your users, and everything else is being left up to us. So those are pretty much the prime targets for disaster recovery as a service. So let's talk a little bit more about it. So one of the benefits is we have one-click failover. So especially with Veeam, they make it very easy to say, okay, I failed. Let's log into either my Veeam console if that's unavailable. Let's log into OffsiteDataSync's Veeam portal. You click on failover, and boom, things start failing over. And based on whether or not you've actually done some good DR testing and have everything planned out as far as how you're going to access this environment, which there are numerous options for, I might add, it's as easy as that and switching over to your disaster recovery plan. We have a lot of customers who are able to perform some of these disaster recovery services, and because they do yearly or bi-yearly disaster recovery tests, they have everything buttoned up from top to bottom as far as the plan to allow users to connect into the environment, to allow the services to come up in the right way. There's a ton of stuff that comes into disaster recovery, and basically the best way to do it is to ensure that you have everything tested, verified, to ensure that in the event that you need it, everything is documented and your users know how to access that disaster recovery environment. And 15-second recovery. So what this means is that within 15 seconds of hitting that failover button, those VMs are going to get spun up. Now, that being said, it might take, especially if you have an older operating system, a few minutes to start. So certainly can't say that, well, that operating system is going to boot in 15 seconds. However, what we can say is that upon hitting that failover, we're able to initiate that recovery, that restore, that starting of those VMs. So that's where we come into that 15-second recovery play. So here's the critical piece, and I've spoken at length with many, many, many customers, and that's going to be how tailored our service is. From working with numerous customers, I can tell you that disaster recovery offers no one-size-fits-all solution. Every organization is different, and we've really taken that to heart here at OffsiteDataSync, because every single disaster recovery customer that comes to us, we have a full conversation with them, specifically when doing our DR tests. We say, what are your objectives? What are your critical services? And we help you as much as we can to try and say, well, here's going to be the best strategy. Here's how your users are going to connect. Here's what makes sense for you based on the technology that you need. But for some of these providers that are saying that, oh, yeah, disaster recovery is as simple as clicking a button and everything is going to work well, that frankly doesn't do a service to how complex some of your business objectives might be. And every organization is different, and we're not going to pretend that we're going to have a one-size-fits-all solution for every organization. So that's why we specifically tailor our disaster recovery as a service product to your organization and to what's going to work best for your users. So let's talk a little bit about the management of it. So we actually offer at OffsiteDataSync monitoring, management, and remediation of day-to-day services with regards to your disaster recovery. Not only that, but also backup as well. But we thought that it was pretty critical to include in the disaster recovery as a service portion here because, again, as I mentioned, disaster recovery can be very, very complicated. It can be very complex. There's a ton of options out there. And what's going to work for you might not work for the person down the street. So that's why we like to offer the management aspect of it. You can utilize the expertise of our engineers, of our architects, to ensure that you know that you're going to have the best solution possible to recover in the event of any sort of disaster. Again, I'm not going to speak too much about this, but hypersecurity. We have end-to-end encryption between your local site and our site. Now, just to mention, this is all accomplished without the need of any sort of VPN or anything. This is all accomplished through Veeam Cloud Connect, which uses SSL to encrypt that data as it's transferring from your local site into the recovery site. Same thing that your bank website uses in order to encrypt those transactions that you might have. So without the overhead of having any sort of VPN or any additional functionality to connect your data up into either the data center or the cloud, you are sure that your data is going to be secure from end to end and that it's going to get up into the cloud securely, and that in the event that you need it, you can spin it up and you'll be secure there as well. Not to mention intelligence. So again, we have a fully integrated portal for reporting, alerting, and protection as far as the disaster recovery goes. We have a portal, so let's say typically in the event of a disaster, your Veeam console, which is what you would normally use to kick off a failover, isn't available. Well, that's all well and good because we have a portal that you can go to and click on that failover, and it's going to go ahead and be able to kick that off based on the boot order or whatever else that you have configured as far as that failover plan. So there's no reason to say, well, okay, my disaster recovery plan is only as good as long as my backup server is available. That's simply not the case. Even if for some reason you don't have internet access and you're unable to reach that portal, you can always call our experts and we actually have the ability to kick off that failover plan for you. So great, this is just a very small diagram that just kind of goes through how disaster recovery as a service works. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it certainly helps a lot of folks when they say, wait, I'm protected by SSL, but there's no VPN. I don't understand. Well, here we can see that on the left side, we have various customers that are all connecting via SSL through their WAN connection through what's called the cloud gateway. Now, this cloud gateway can be effectively considered as a proxy that's going to send your data, whether it be replication or backup data, into the various targets simply by order of proxy. And what ends up happening is because of these cloud gateways, we don't need to establish that VPN connection or anything like that. All we need to do is just enter in a web address, enter in the correct port. We have our tenant credentials, username and password, and once we enter that in, you're good to go and you're ready to start sending your replicas into the cloud. If you have any more questions about this, again, I could speak at length about just this diagram right here, but we certainly don't have enough time for that. But if you have any questions, please don't hesitate to reach out, and our sales engineers would be more than happy to kind of clear some of this up as well if anything I said didn't make any sense. Great. So we're moving on to backup as a service. So as I mentioned originally, this is kind of the lowest tier as a service offering that we offer. We're effectively saying, okay, here's your backups. We'll store them in the cloud for you. And at the very base level, that's all backup as a service is, storing your backups in the cloud. Now, that's all well and good, and it certainly serves its purpose, especially with regards to meeting Veeam's 3-2-1 rule. You don't really want to put all your eggs in one basket, as they say, to say, well, okay, well, I have my backup data. It's going to a NAS, or I still see it even to this day, but maybe a USB hard drive on site. Certainly not the best idea in the world, but people still do it. It's okay. So that's fine and everything, but if there is any sort of disaster that impacts the entire building, a fire or what have you, doesn't really matter how many copies of that data that you have because it's all within the same physical location. So you still have that single point of failure there, whereas if that single location becomes compromised, then guess what? You're really not going to be able to recover any of that data, assuming there was any sort of fire or security breach or something like that. So that's where backup as a service comes in. For those organizations that say, well, yeah, I don't really need the features of infrastructure as a service. My infrastructure runs fine. Maybe I just purchased some new hardware. Disaster recovery as a service sounds nice, but my business, we've done the math, we're able to withstand 24 hours of downtime. So really, all I want to do is just have an insurance policy that says my backup data is going to be somewhere outside of my physical location, and it's going to be sent there easily, and I'm going to know that it's there, and I'm going to know that that data is secure. So that's really who backup as a service is for. Now, there's a little bit more to OffsiteDataSync's iteration of backup as a service because we've taken it a little bit farther. I'm going to talk about that in just a few moments, but first, let's talk about the benefits of backup as a service. So there's lower, cost of ownership. Basically, backup as a service is the cheapest cloud offering you have. You pay X amount per terabyte, you send your data up there, and that's it. There's really no other cost to incur. It's simple, especially with regards to Veeam. Anyone who uses Veeam Cloud Connect knows that it's one of the most simple things to connect to a Veeam Cloud Connect repository. It's as simple as going into Veeam, typing in service provider, hitting in the URL, username, password, assuming all that information is correct. Boom, you have a cloud repository that you can start sending your data to. It is so very simple, and I can't tell you how many calls I've been on with folks, and they say, well, that's it, huh? I could have done that. Yeah, you very well could have, but it's easier when we connect. So the other good part is that we're going to get great performance on our Veeam Cloud Connect backup. Some providers will cheap out on the storage that they're storing their backups in, and Veeam, depending on exactly how you have it configured, can have some pretty high I/O requirements with regards to creating backup merges, things of that nature. So OffsiteDataSync, our backup is based on nimble storage, so it's going to be hybrid of spinning disk and solid state drive. So we're actually able to beat most of our competitors' performance, specifically for the price quote that we're looking for that backup storage. So you can expect to not have to wait a fair amount of time for a lot of these high IOP intensive routines to run, specifically on merging data, creating GFS points if that's something that you need. For those of you unaware, GFS is effectively Veeam's solution to archiving. So that performance is still going to be there despite the fact that it is the cheaper of the cloud service offerings. And you have more options than you do on-prem. If you do backup as a service, you basically, again, it's simple. You connect up to the cloud. Those on-premise options that you have, and I've seen it all. I've seen folks take a USB drive off-site every week and replace it with another one, send backups to that USB drive, and then take the next one off-site. It works, but again, it's a much better option to do it into the cloud environment. And here's the kicker, is you have access to additional recovery services, specifically with OffsiteDataSync's implementation of backup as a service. So I'm not going to get into this too much, but with backup as a service, we actually offer a tier of availability to where you can actually perform a DR test with our backup as a service. So what does that mean? I thought you just had our backups. Well, what we do is we actually connect with you as the customer, and because these backups are stored simply as Veeam backup files, all we're going to do is say, okay, you can decrypt your backups and we'll restore it into our same infrastructure as a service environment. Now that's great, you might say, well, what's the point of disaster recovery as a service if I have this option to me? Well, disaster recovery as a service is going to be, again, for those customers who have low RTOs or recovery time objectives. With backup as a service, we're basically initiating a full VM restore of that data. So this is going to be great for those customers who have done the math, they've crunched the numbers and said, okay, I can withstand 24 hours of downtime. So with that said, if I encounter any kind of disaster situation, I've done DR tests with OffsiteDataSync, and I know that typically I can expect 18-hour restore time. So with that, they might be able to say, well, I'm not going to pay the extra money for disaster recovery as a service, but I'll stick with OffsiteDataSync's backup as a service. And that's completely valid for some companies. That's more than fine. And we fully embrace that, which is why we came up with this product to begin with. Now, for those of you who have stricter RTO requirements, you might want to look at that disaster recovery as a service platform. But that being said, we're not going to leave our backup as a service customers out in the cold, and we still offer that disaster recovery functionality for them. It's just certainly not going to be as quick, even close to as quick as the regular disaster recovery as a service offering. So who is it meant for? Those needing more than on-prem. I've already covered that. Organizations with little or no IT staff, because it's so simple, because everything is handled directly through Veeam, you don't really need a large IT staff to make sure that this is working. Everything just kind of goes to the cloud, and it's a very simple platform, very simple product, so you could get by with little to no IT staff as far as managing your backups. If you're a large organization with lots of data and you don't really have a place to store lots of this data, our backup as a service offering, again, is going to meet those lower cost objectives. So it might actually make financial sense to send a lot of this data up into the backup as a service, specifically organizations with lots of non-critical data. So we do have a number of customers that will split between DRaaS and backup as a service, because they say, well, we have these mission critical applications that might, if they go down, going to cost us a lot of money. But then again, we have tens and terabytes of data that, frankly, it's necessary to our business, but we don't need it immediately. So they'll sometimes split their offering between DRaaS and backup as a service, and that's where we get into a lot of the fun things as far as designing these solutions for our customers. International organizations who need to meet some of these new requirements, specifically over in the EU, there's been a lot of data locality laws and things of that nature. So, you might not be able to utilize some other services that may not promise to keep your data in some of those locality-driven origins. At OffsiteDataSync, we have a number of data centers in specific localities that fall into some of these needs. So it might just make sense because if you're an international organization and need to keep data that's housed in some country in the EU or some country in Asia within those countries' borders, makes certain sense that you want to use a backup as a service provider that has a data center in that same country to make sure that you're meeting those requirements. And again, as I mentioned before, it's also great for organizations that are testing as a service cloud providers and kind of dipping their toes into that water and seeing, well, I'm still a little wary of the cloud, but maybe it is for me. Let's test it out a little bit. Let's test out backup as a service. Let's restore some of my data to the cloud, and let's just see how it works. And again, maybe it'll work out, and you might be able to save yourself some money by moving up to the cloud. All right, so really quick, we're just going to go through here. Backup as a service, it's flexible. It's dynamically allocated cloud storage. You can increase as you need it. Let's say you have, a very large art department, and they decided to, create 1 terabyte worth of drawings, and you need to make sure that's backed up. It's very easy. We have a number of options as far as our backup as a service goes to dynamically increase your cloud storage so that you don't have to worry about potentially hitting those limits. Certainly good for organizations, again, that require an excessive amount of growth. It's AWS and Azure friendly, so you can store nearline backups with ODS. We can send long-term archives and data to AWS or Azure based on your retention policy. These are for a lot of these organizations that need to have, 5-10-year retention. A lot of these folks are saying, well, we need long-term archival storage, and we've been developing products that are able to accomplish that for minimal cost. Again, we included this as far as backup as a service as well as tailored. As I mentioned, we have a lot of folks that, there's no one-size-fits-all, so we tailor our services to your needs, and we make sure that whatever services that we offer you are going to fully satisfy those needs, depending on whatever they might be. And again, just want to mention manage. This is something that our team actually does quite a bit, is manage a lot of customers' backups for them, because backup management can be a bit cumbersome, especially if you're not an expert in the field. Specifically Veeam, it's a very simple platform, but once you really start digging under the layers, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of tweaks and everything that you can do, and you can sure utilize our experts to make sure that your backups are running as seamlessly as they possibly can. Hypersecure, I already spoke about this, and it's using the same technology that we spoke about before with regards to Cloud Connect replication, because it's the same underlying technology. Rather than sending a replica in this case, we're simply sending it to a backup repository. But same SSL-based encryption, same everything that you're able to use to verify that your data is going to be sent up into the cloud, and it's going to be sent up there securely, and it's also going to be there securely at rest. And intelligence, online portal, same thing. You can log in, increase your services, add additional services. Everything is managed from our online portal, and you're able to go in there and dynamically increase that. So some folks might be wondering, can one replace the other? Well, if I haven't mentioned enough, each of these three environments is going to serve a different need, and it's going to come down to what your desires are or what your needs are for your organization as far as which one you want to choose, and potentially even multiple. So just to reiterate, the infrastructure as service is we're saying your infrastructure is going to go entirely in the cloud. That's it. Everything's in the cloud. And we could do some disaster recovery to other clouds, even some of our other data centers. There's a lot to talk about that, but your main infrastructure in the cloud. Disaster recovery as a service is only those disaster recovery pieces are going in the cloud, and backup as a service is only your backups in the cloud. And with a little caveat there that we can also do some disaster recovery from there, but it's not going to be nearly as quick, and we're not going to meet some of those lower recovery time objectives that we would normally meet with the disaster recovery as a service option. So just to kind of turn things over to Brandon, we're going to talk to you a little. He's going to talk to you a little bit about our services, backup as a service, and disaster recovery as a service that are powered by Veeam Solutions. So Brandon, why don't you take it away?
Thanks a lot, Brad, and thanks everyone for joining. So I am Brandon McCoy over here at Veeam Software, coming to you live from Atlanta, Georgia. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about Veeam. Some of you may or may not know who we are. So we'll start here with some of our more impressive stats. So we start from the top left. We have 827 million in bookings for 2017. We continue to grow, I'd say around 30% year over year, with over 300,000 customers worldwide. 17 million workloads protected. So even though we continue to grow year after year and become a bigger company with bigger goals, we never lose sight of our customers, and you can see that in our Net Promoter Score. That is, I believe, plus 73, which is 3.5 times the leading industry average, and that's based on customer feedback by, brand confidence, customer loyalty and satisfaction, as well as an overall marker of whether or not that company will succeed, which we obviously are at this time. So we're also in the leadership category of our products, right? So we started in around 2008, protecting virtual workloads. We were very heavily invested with VMware in terms of our product delivery. As we grew, we started to also support Hyper-V, but it was really just the virtual space, and it was really for more of the on-premises environments where we were protecting. In 2012, you see us beginning to expand our reach and enabling availability across the data center as we introduced Cloud Connect, which is the service that OffsiteDataSync uses with Veeam in order to deliver those availabilities for your data, right, in our private cloud offerings. And then in 2018, today and beyond, we want to be the leader in intelligent data management for the hyper-available enterprises. So that's a multi-cloud strategy, and the word cloud's been tossed around a lot today. So as the IaaS as a service. So we're going to definitely get into cloud in more terms, as we already have a little bit. But just another moment here to talk about Veeam, an industry leadership with momentum. So 80% of Fortune 500 companies rely on Veeam to make sure that their data centers are always on and always available. And that's one of the many reasons that we see 39 quarters straight of double-digit growth. Our goal is eventually to get to 1 billion, and we are well on our way. And that's not just because of Veeam's innovation, it's also because of you, our customers and partners. So you can't get to that $1 billion mark without a vision. And Veeam's vision, as we see here, is to be the most trusted provider of intelligent data management solutions to meet the expectations of a world that demands the hyper-availability of data. So I know that's a lot, it's a mouthful, right? But if you break it down, it just means that we want to be trusted by our customers, which again, our Net Promoter Score shows that. We have a lot of recognition in the industry, brand loyalty, and that intelligent data management. So not just being able to manage your data solutions, but that intelligent data management means backup policies, more of a behavior-driven versus a policy-driven. So we see things like, vTags and vCenter, and being able to categorize data and categorize when backups happen and meeting specific SLAs, right? And that's in a world that demands the hyper-availability of data. So, I kind of compare data today like the internet. 10, 20 years ago, if you wanted to make a phone call, you had to go home to make that phone call. If you wanted to get an email, you had to go home or go to your work and, log on the modem to get that email. But today, that's all at your fingertips. We can talk across our phones. We have it all in our pocket. The internet and communication is available to us, and we want to make that same goal with data, and that's what Veeam is striving to do. And we do that with a few things. So if you look at this circle here with the cloud icon starting from the left, you see the 3 hypervisors that we support. So again, we started with VMware, then we soon after introduced Hyper-V. Today we also support Acropolis, which is Nutanix hypervisor. So we're spreading our reach, right? We're becoming a broader company, but we're never losing focus on what we do best, which is just protecting data, right? We don't want to spread ourselves thin, but we want to be able to protect availability data centers across the globe. So that's in our private cloud as well. So people like OffsiteDataSync having the ability to fail over into those data centers, right? Or maybe more of a managed cloud where you still have some control, some access. That's more of a mix between some public and private clouds. As far as our public cloud offerings, so it's no secret, we also support those, AWS, Azure, IBM Cloud. And while the public cloud is a great way to go for some, it's not the end all be all for everyone. I think it's important to note, maybe even on this call, that places like AWS and Azure, IBM Cloud, they're big names, they're great, they do a lot of things. We do integrate with some of those services, but they can't provide you the same sort of services that a private cloud provider like OffsiteDataSync can, right? And that specifically has to do with disaster recovery. So whenever you think disaster recovery, immediate failover, you click a button, things are running, that's traditionally not what public cloud is used for. We also see some integration with edge devices, the Internet of Things. So think about a CEO wanting to go on vacation, halfway across the country, but he's worried about his or her data center, not being up, not being able to run, but maybe just log in from a laptop or a cell phone, click a button, and spinning up machines into a cloud type environment, right? We also see these SaaS offerings. So Office 365. A lot of customers today still don't realize that Office 365 is just a service. It does not guarantee your data. It just guarantees uptime of the services that you're using. So it's up to you to protect that data from ransomware, from bad retention policies or malicious employees. Right, and then we also have support for our physical machines. So again, when Veeam started, it was purely virtual. Some thought that we'd never get into this space, but we realized the demand for those physical machines that are still around for various reasons. So Windows, Linux, we have recently announced support for Oracle Solaris and AIX as well. If we look in the middle here, this is how we get to that vision. So if you start from the bottom, universal APIs. So we've written the code for universal APIs for storage snapshots. So you think the NetApps, the Nimbles, the 3PARs of the world, being able to take snapshots directly on those storage devices and taking the load off of those ESXi workloads. We have backup and recovery, replication and failover, right? So whether you just want to have a backup file on a disk that you can grab a file from, you can restore an email, you can make some changes to Active Directory, or whether you need a full-blown solution like Brad was talking about earlier with the DRaaS, right? Disaster Recovery as a Service, where you can literally click a button and your environment is now in the OffsiteDataSync cloud. Right, then we have, that kind of leads us into the cloud services. And you can think of cloud as the infrastructure as a service too. You may even have some workloads that you want to migrate. So don't think about Veeam and OffsiteDataSync as just protection or recovery. You can also think about them as a migration path. Maybe you have an on-prem Exchange server and you want to get it into Office 365, right? Maybe you have public workloads running in Azure and they're starting to cost you more than you thought. Maybe you want to get those machines out of the public cloud and into OffsiteDataSync's infrastructure as a service, or even back to on-prem, right? And then that kind of also gets us into the cloud to cloud. So you might have some cloud workloads that you want to move to another cloud and vice versa. On the other side, you see physical. So I just already mentioned that, we have the Veeam agents for those various operating machines, bare metal restore on dissimilar hardware, even some basic P2V conversions, right? And the same kind of great functionality that you would expect with Veeam. In the middle, we see software as a service. I like to think of that as solution as a service, and that's really what Veeam strives to do. Veeam wants to be able to support any app, any data, on any cloud at any time, giving you that always-on experience and bringing an availability platform. Excuse me. Visibility and control. So that is Veeam One monitoring, right? That is the Veeam Availability Console, which is a product that our service providers, such as OffsiteDataSync, use to make sure that they can that all your backup jobs are succeeding. Customers can have access to these kinds of consoles as well to make sure that their backups are good, to get invoicing on the services they're consuming. And that also talks about data labs, right? So at the top you see those data labs there. So those data labs are, think of an on-demand sandbox, right? Maybe you get hit with ransomware, and for whatever reason you don't have any backups in the cloud just yet. So you're relying on your local backups to restore from. But before you push that restore button, you may want to make sure that those backups aren't encrypted as well. So wouldn't it be great if you could just restore those into an isolated sandbox that Veeam deploys for you? And again, this is all software. This is not some big fancy kind of box that you have to purchase, right? We do all this on your hypervisor. We'll test those backups. We'll make sure that they're viable. We'll check VMware tools heartbeats, things like that, right? In the future, we're going to announce some additional cool features in Q1 where you can restore a VM or a backup into this data lab and then run your antivirus software on it and quarantine out anything that you find. Maybe you want to use it as for R&D purposes, etc. So those are just some of the really cool things that keep Veeam in the front of the pack in terms of data management. And finally, just talking about the multi-cloud strategy. So like I said, cloud is kind of an ambiguous term at times. I think Brad's done a great job of showing us the different as-a-services, and almost all of those, I believe, were directly related to cloud. So whether that cloud is the infrastructure, whether that cloud is a backup location, or whether that cloud is a completely separate site in order to fail over to in case of some natural disaster, power outage, etc. And it says here that 81% of enterprises have a multi-cloud strategy. So you need to think about that. Whether you're a customer or a partner, you need to think about that gap, right? Whether you're the customer who wants to make sure that their business is always protected, not have to worry about downtime. What if you have some kind of website where transactions are done and that website goes down? The SQL server on the back end that hosts that website is down. If a customer can't, enter in their credit card information to check out, they're going to go to the next website, right? So need to think about things like that when you're thinking about reasons for the cloud, having that always on. And then finally, from a partner perspective, there's a gap, right? These customers are beginning to become aware that they need some sort of cloud protection, whether that's backing up their Office 365, whether that's having their backups in some sort of cloud. And you can partner with OffsiteDataSync, and you can even get into some of these services yourself and provide that gap in the market for a cloud strategy. So with that, I think I'll turn it back over to Brad for the remainder of the session, and happy to answer any questions after the demo. Thanks, everyone.
Awesome. Thanks, Brandon. So we've actually gone quite a bit. We're pretty close to the extent of our time here, so I'm just going to rush through the last few slides here. And the last one is basically coming down to choosing the right provider. Where do you store your data? How's your data backed up? How quickly can that data be restored in the event that you need it? These are questions that you need to ask yourself, and also your prospective cloud providers about, it's very important. What do we want to do? How do we want to restore this data? How quickly can it be restored? A lot of these things are going to be very different from provider to provider, so just make sure that you contact your provider and ensure that they're going to be able to meet whatever requirements that you have. So just to speak a little bit about OffsiteDataSync, we're trusted. We've 2 times Veeam Partner of the Year, recognized for outstanding growth and performance. We're experienced. We're one of the largest Veeam cloud and service providers globally, with tens of thousands of physical and virtual machines under protection. Security and compliance, I've already spoken about these. Our data centers meet pretty much every acronym that you could throw at it, and any of that information can be received by speaking to some of our account executives, some of our sales folks. We have credentialed professionals, disaster recovery experts, VMCE, VMCA, VMCE, VAO, which is kind of the combination of the two, along with VCP, which is the VMware certifications, and CCNA, CCNP, which is the Cisco certification. So we have engineers who have, pretty much a ton of acronyms at the end of their names that says that they understand this stuff. And from their experience, I can tell you that we employ some great folks, and they're wonderful to work for, or work with, rather. We have a lot of forward-thinking folks, so public cloud integration, hybrid cloud aware, hypervisor agnostic solutions. These are some things that are going to really start coming down the pike in the next few years here. So that's one of the great things about OffsiteDataSync is we're always forward-thinking, where we can say, okay, well, we can do this now, but as I mentioned before, technology is always changing, and we take it upon ourselves to have personal responsibility to say, okay, well, here's how technology is going to change. Here's what we want our services to be in the future. Professional services, I mentioned we do a lot of management. We have a lot of flexible services, and depending on your needs, we can really discuss a lot of those with you in pricing options. If you have any issues handling your backup or disaster recovery services, please contact some of our sales folks. We'd love to talk to you a little bit about how we can help you out and how you can leverage some of our expertise. Not only that, global presence, whether you're in North America, EMEA, APAC markets, we have data centers to fit your needs. So with that being said, I'm just going to pass it back to Kelly to wrap things up here for us. Kelly?
Hey, thank you so much, Brad. Thank you, Brandon. We do have a few questions in the chat. I know we're running short on time, but if I could at least ask the first couple of questions that did come in, would that be okay?
Sounds good to me.
Okay. The first one's from Mark. So regarding the DRaaS tailoring that you talked about, how much of what you described in tailoring DRaaS is included in the cost of the service, or how much is additional paid consulting?
See, that's a great question, and it's incredibly hard to answer because, like I mentioned, disaster recovery is something that is, it's no one-size-fits-all. So if you have some basic questions for us about, okay, my users connect in this way, and if I fell over to your environment, what's it going to look like for my users to connect to? That's certainly, we're going to be able to say, okay, well, that's easy, here we go. But if you come to us and you say, well, I don't know how I want my users to connect, here's kind of how they connect now, what are the options that you have available for me, and what's the cost of implementing, and can you help me implement these solutions and provide documentation to connect to my users? Well, that might be something a little bit more in the range of us saying, okay, well, let's look a little bit more. We're going to do an audit of your environment. We're going to take a look at the software you have, your business critical applications, and perform some time to actually really dig in here and assist you with this. So it's always going to be a bit of a per customer basis, but that being said, we're always able to help out as much as we possibly can. So feel free to reach out in any of the numbers or email addresses that you see there, and just let us know if you have any questions, and we'd be more than happy to clear that up a little bit more for you. It's going to come down to a customer by customer thing, though.
Yeah, sounds like it does. Okay, thank you. Here's another one from Antonio. So in the Veeam DRaaS solution, is it possible to establish a VPN connections from multiple locations to a virtual firewall running in OffsiteDataSync's infrastructure?
Great question. So the answer with the base Veeam Cloud Connect replication as it stands at the moment, with base functionality, base features, no. However, OffsiteDataSync, we understand that that's a need for many clients. So we have a number of options as far as spinning up third-party virtual firewalls that you might be able to use, but even better, coming with Update 4, Veeam is going to have the ability to integrate with our infrastructure as a service platform, and with that platform, you get a fully functional virtual firewall, and with that, you're able to establish those multiple VPN connections too. So with that added functionality that is going to be a 100% supported feature upon the release of Veeam Update 4 with regards to that connection of the infrastructure as a service. Until then, we offer the ability to spin up either open source or paid for virtual firewalls in order to facilitate that, because obviously we see that as a need for our customers.
Sorry about that, I put myself on mute. Thank you. Okay, stemming from that question, so same from Antonio, says we understand how the cloud gateway works, but we'd still like to know if our principal site fails, is it possible for our branches to connect to the replicated servers at OffsiteDataSync without publishing services on the internet?
So very similar question that comes into the VPN connection. Again, yes, it's always possible. It's just a matter of what that technology is going to look like, how that's going to work. Best things I like to say about technology is most of it is possible. It just comes down to the complexity and what exactly it is that you're looking for. So that's certainly something that personally I love getting involved with. So please reach out to some of our sales folks, and they'd be more than happy to get you in touch with one of our architects or engineers and be able to discuss that a little bit further. But short answer, yes, absolutely possible.
Awesome. Got one last one for you. Regarding backup as a service, this comes in from Mark also. Is the backup of the virtual machines, et cetera, or just the data? For example, is it just the Oracle or the MySQL databases, or is it, I guess, the full virtual machine?
Sure. So with Veeam, it's done based on the actual full virtual machine using snapshot-based backups. So it basically takes a full volume level of the various virtual disks along with the configuration files associated with that backup file. So if you were to initiate a restore, while you can explore specific aspects of that virtual machine through Veeam's various application explorers, such as SQL Explorer and Exchange Explorer, all that good stuff, the base level, you do have the full ability to restore the VM in its entirety back into either your environment or some other piece of environment just from that single Veeam backup.
Yeah, and just to add to that, Brad, in those Veeam Explorers, we're also able to take those databases, so for instance, the Oracle or the SQL databases, and move those to another VM in your environment. So if you needed to do some sort of migration, we do all the log truncation, log replays of those various databases inside the image.
Good point, Brandon. Thank you. Okay, well, that's all the questions we have in the queue today. Thank you so much, Brad and Brandon. This was a really great presentation, and I think it was very helpful. You've got quite a few thank yous there also in the question board, so we appreciate that. So with that, I believe we will conclude today's presentation unless you have anything further to add, guys.
That's it from me. Thanks, everyone.
I'm good here, Kelly. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us.
Great. Thank you all. Have a good afternoon. Thank you.